Today's breaking news. Bang Si-hyuk, the chairman of HYBE, also known as Hitman Bang, will face his first police summons on September 15th. And he is expected to stand at the photo line in front of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency. So here's an exclusive article that was uploaded on September 10th this morning. Exclusive, Bang Si-hyuk to face first police questioning on the 15th, expected to stand at the photo line. Police are set to summon HYBE chairman Bang Si-hyuk for questioning on September 15th, according to reports on the 9th. Bang Si-hyuk is under investigation on allegations that during HYBE's listing process, he misled investors into believing there were no plans to go public, persuaded them to sell shares, and then pocketed profits of around 200 billion won from the IPO. This will be the first time he appears before investigators. According to information obtained by this paper, Bang Si-hyuk has agreed to police to appear at 10 a.m. on September 15th at the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency's Serious Crime Investigation Unit in Mapo, Seoul. Police conducted a search and seizure at HYBE's Yongsan headquarters at the end of July and recently finished analyzing the seized materials. Bang Si-hyuk returned from the United States on August 11th and has remained in Korea since. An investigative source said, since Bang Si-hyuk did not request a closed-door appearance, it is highly likely that he will stand at the photo line when appearing before police. Interesting. Investigators believe that in 2019, here's a graphic that the journalist shared in the article, and I have translated for you. So investigations and probes related to HYBE chairman Bang Si-hyuk. Financial Supervisory Service happened June 28th. Bang Si-hyuk was summoned for questioning. Yeah, so that was for the FSS, Financial Supervisory Service. He has been questioned before, but not by the police. Okay, so that's why the article says that it's going to be his first time. On July 16th, they filed a complaint against Bang Si-hyuk with prosecutors. Who did that? FSC, Financial Services Commission, filed a complaint against Bang Si-hyuk with prosecutors. July 24th, Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency did a search and seizure at HYBE headquarters. And on September 15th, Bang Si-hyuk is to be summoned for questioning. That's scheduled. And on July 30th, National Tax Service, NTS, began special tax investigation into HYBE. And I believe I covered each of these events on my channel. Right? So let's move on to the next segment in the article. Investigators believe that in 2019, before HYBE's listing, Bang Si-hyuk arranged for close associates, including a former outside director of HYBE, to set up a private equity fund. That fund then purchased HYBE's unlisted shares from investors. Bang Si-hyuk is accused of persuading investors to sell their shares to the fund by insisting that HYBE had no listing plans. However, Bang Si-hyuk had signed a contract entitling him to 30% of the profits from share sales linked to the IPO. The fund sold off a large number of HYBE shares immediately after the listing, and regulators believe that Bang Si-hyuk received around 200 billion won under the agreement. Police suspect this conduct may constitute unfair trading under the Capital Markets Act. Sounds like same old Korean media agency articles. Now, Bang Si-hyuk's side is expected to deny the allegations. Notably, the institutional investors identified as victims did not file lawsuits or complaints against HYBE or Bang Si-hyuk, nor did they raise objections for roughly 5 years after the company went public. That's true. The Financial Services Commission's Securities and Futures Commission, which filed a complaint against Bang Si-hyuk, identified LB Investment, Alpen Route Asset Management, Chinese venture capital firm Legend Capital, and former HYBE co-founder and vice president Choi Yoo-jung as affected parties. However, as these investors reaped substantial gains from their HYBE investments, they have not claimed victimhood. Interesting. So this particular article, exclusive piece, decided to include this information, whereas a lot of Korean media articles have not done that. For example, the article says, LB Investment put in 6.5 billion won and exited with 120 billion Korean won, while Alpha and Route Asset Management recorded profits exceeding 10 billion won. An industry insider commented, at the time, many institutional investors sold their HYBE shares due to fund maturities and risk management strategies. Apart from BTS, HYBE didn't have other major artists then, and with many BTS members nearing military service, it was hard to justify an overly high valuation for the company. Legal experts stress that the case hinges on whether Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE deliberately misled investors and on the circumstances surrounding the institution's decision to sell at the time. Lee Jung-soo, who's a professor at Seoul National University's School of Law, said, it's crucial to examine whether investors had at least some awareness of a potential IPO and what their true motives were when they sold the shares. Okay, so that was the article. And again, here is a timeline for investigations and probes related to HYBE chairman Bang Si-hyuk. So as you know, I have already covered these issues, HYBE's IPO and the so-called Bang Si-hyuk controversy in detail on my channel before through these videos with these thumbnails. And until just a few weeks ago, Korean media were blindly attacking HYBE and Bang Si-hyuk with hit pieces without much detail. But in contrast, capital market related professional outlets like The Bell and Deal Site analyzed the issue thoroughly based on facts and details that not many people knew about, which I covered in these videos. But lately, other Korean media have also started to report on it in more detail. For example, the media called Kuki News has been running a series called The HYBE Scandal, HYBE 사태, and so far they have published 3 articles in it, and as they point out, the reality is far murkier and perhaps less damning than the headlines suggest. So let's quickly go through each of them for recap. So, for example, the first article, this one, emphasizes that the investors now labeled as quote-unquote victims of Bang Si-hyuk's actions actually walked away with huge profits, which this particular exclusive piece that I just read you and translated for you mentions. So, firms like LB Investment, Legend Capital, and Alpha and Route Asset Management put money into HYBE, which was then Big Hit Entertainment, long before BTS was a global name. At the time, BTS' future was uncertain. The company had no other major artists, and military enlistment loomed as a serious risk. And these investors began selling their stakes between 2018 and 2019, largely due to funds maturity deadlines, liquidity crisis, and portfolio adjustments. So instead of losing money, they multiplied their investments many times over. Like LB, for example, earned nearly 20 times its capital. Alpha and Route posted a 50% gain in less than 2 years. Legend Capital eventually enjoyed massive IPO windfalls. And if they truly felt deceived, insiders argue they would have raised objections years ago and perhaps have taken legal actions, but they didn't. So the controversy now, is less about fraud and more about hindsight and, hindsight bias. Because only after BTS conquered the world, the piece says, did those early exits look like a mistimed decision. So that's what the first article of this series points out. Now, the second article shifts focus to the contracts that regulators describe as evidence of Bang Si-hyuk's misconduct. So in 2018 and 2019, HYBE was still considered a risky bet. To attract private equity investment, Bang Si-hyuk personally agreed to kind of risky terms, put-back options that forced him to buy back shares with interest if the IPO failed, and earn-out clauses that handed investors 30% of profits if it succeeded. And these were not, like sweetheart deals for Bang Si-hyuk. They were risky lifelines that could have bankrupted him if BTS failed to break through. Ultimately, BTS' explosion onto the global stage turned those risks into reward. HYBE's IPO succeeded, and Bang Si-hyuk received about 400 billion won through the earnout. But far from being evidence of manipulation, such arrangements are common in private equity and were often demanded by investors themselves, as industry experts have noted. And legal scholars also question whether applying, capital markets fraud laws to what were essentially private shareholder agreements even makes sense. So Bang Si-hyuk's critics focus on the profits that he gained, through the earnout clauses. But defenders stress that he accepted massive downside risk and reinvested, much of his payout back into HYBE as a company. Now, the third article, so that's what the second article points out. Now, the third article in the series tackles the most explosive allegation that Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE concealed their earnout contracts, creating conditions for stock manipulation during the IPO. So on HYBE's first day of trading in October 2020, the stock price doubled out of the gate before plunging, which left retail investors who bought at the top experienced heavy losses. And private equity funds tied to Bang Si-hyuk sold nearly 2 trillion won in shares that day, which fueled claims that hidden deals had distorted the market. Yet, industry insiders argue that the HYBE stock manipulation story is overstated. Overhang risk, like the possibility of large post-IPO sell-offs, were clearly flagged in IPO filings and brokerage reports, they say. And some funds were subject to lockups while others weren't, which was typical at the time. And HYBE and its bankers insist all contracts were disclosed to underwriters and vetted by law firms, which concluded no disclosure was legally required in the prospectus. The Korea Exchange itself did not sanction HYBE, instead choosing to tighten future IPO disclosure rules in response. And the article frames the current controversy as partly political, like in a climate where Korea's president Lee Jae-myung has called for harsh crackdowns on market misconduct. HYBE risk being made into a showcase, first case for punishment, regardless of whether its IPO practices were truly out of line with industry norms. So taken together, these series written by the media agency Kuki News paints a different picture from the HYBE stock manipulation headlines. Early investors profited handsomely rather than suffering losses. Bang Si-hyuk accepted enormous personal risk through contracts that only paid off because BTS succeeded beyond all expectations. And while retail investors were hurt by day one volatility, disclosures about potential sell-offs were available in public documents. Now, while this particular news series provide a broad, industry-level view of HYBE's IPO controversy, another outlet called NEWSTOP has added some nuance. So their reporting highlights how some of the most, contested elements of the case look very different when you revisit the facts from 2018 to 2019, rather than through the lens of today's investigation. So first of all, this particular article points out that the very funds that regulators now label as victims, Elbow Investment, Legend Capital, and Often Route Asset Management, each had compelling internal reasons to sell when they did. LB faced a standard fund maturity deadline in 2019 and liquidated as required by its structure, ultimately turning a 6.5 billion won investment into more than 100 billion won. Legend Capital had promised its own limited partners a partial return of capital and requested that HYBE undergo an external audit to demonstrate IPO potential, which is a step that prosecutors now portray as evidence of Bang Si-hyuk secretly preparing to list. But in fact, it was investors themselves who requested that. Alphen Route, meanwhile, was caught in the fallout of the so-called Lime asset management crisis, and they desperately needed liquidity to meet redemption demands. And these were not investors, being tricked into selling too early, but rather firms acting out of necessity, as the article argues. So all of them realized substantial profits, some multiplying their money many times over. And also, this article stresses that replacing these investors was far from easy. At the time, BTS, their looming military service, and HYBE's dependence on a single artist made many institutional investors hesitate. Like Stick Investment finally stepped in, buying a 12.4% stake for 103.9 billion won, which is a deal considered risky at the time because HYBE had no concrete IPO plan. But Stick insisted on protective clauses, which is a putback option, guaranteeing repayment if no IPO occurred, and an earnout clause sharing profits if one did. So these terms, as this article notes, were not unusual, but rather a pragmatic way to balance high risk with potential upside. The regulators claim Eastern EP was a front, set up to funnel profits to Bang Si-hyuk. But this article reframes Eastern as more of a stopgap solution, which is a fund that helped absorb shares when no other buyers were willing. And the key figure was Kim Jung-dong, who was HYBE's former CIO and outside director who had long experience in cultural investments. But with his involvement, Eastern replicated Stick's contract structure and complete with putback and earnout terms. This whole thing sounds complicated, but as I've told you, I have already covered these issues, including Kim Jung-dong as a figure in my previous videos. So go check them out if you're interested. But back to the article, when HYBE went public in 2020, both Stick and Eastern earned huge returns. That's true, while Bang Si-hyuk received around 400 billion won under the earnout. That's also true. But according to this article, this was less a scheme of manipulation than the payoff for having personally shouldered the risk that had HYBE failed, he would have been forced to repay billions out of pocket. And the NEWSTOP piece closes with a critique. It argues that the current investigation risks rewriting history to fit a prosecution theory. So by ignoring the investor's own motivations and the industry standard nature of these contracts, regulators are framing the exits as coerced by Bang Si-hyuk, when in reality, they were driven by financial logic at the time. So to paint the deals as fraudulent is to, misshow common or to miss how common such risk-sharing agreements are in private equity and how much personal risk that Bang Si-hyuk actually took on. So overall, these articles that have been released recently in the Korean media reveal two sides of the same controversy. The first series that I noted, by Kuki News, stresses that early investors profited rather than suffered, and that Bang Si-hyuk contracts were high-risk wagers rather than guaranteed scams. And the second one goes further, showing in detail why those investors sold when they did, how difficult it was to find new investors, and how Eastern's role was less sinister than opportunistic. And the combined picture suggests that while HYBE's IPO was far from conventional, labeling it as a stock manipulation or investor fraud oversimplifies a much more complex, risk-heavy set of deals. So the central question is whether Bang Si-hyuk's actions constituted deliberate deception or whether regulators are retroactively, casting like normal investment structures as illegal, even though it could have been perceived as aggressive. And as the investigation unfolds, the controversy shows the tension between Korea's push for stricter market discipline under the current administration and the messy realities of high-stakes startup financing. So, when Bang Si-hyuk shows up at the police station on September 15th, the headlines will probably focus on fraud and manipulation. But if you read through the deeper reporting, the story looks much more complicated. And this isn't just about a mogul tricking investors. It's about how high-risk contracts and fund structures and market timing played out in real time, long before anyone knew that BTS would, quote-unquote, conquer the world. By the way, the photo included in this article that I discussed in the start of this video, the one using the exclusive report about Bang Si-hyuk's upcoming police summons, was actually taken just last month on August 15th at the national inauguration ceremony in Gwanghwamun Square for President Lee Jae-myung. So, interestingly, I'm going to talk about JYP in a moment, the reason why I included that photo. And it was a high-profile event marking the 80th anniversary of liberation, attended by President Lee Jae-myung. And also major chaebol leaders like Samsung's Lee Jae-yong, Hyundai's Chung Lee-sun, and LG and Lotte. And Bang Si-hyuk was right there among Korea's corporate elite. Do I have other photos here? Yeah, here we go. So these were the photos. Here's Samsung Lee Jae-yong and other chaebol leaders, and here's Bang Si-hyuk. So, and the timing is kind of striking. On August 15th, he was at a state event alongside the country's top business leaders. But exactly 1 month later, what happens? On September 15th, he will be walking into a police station to face investigators. So the contrast alone kind of captures just how extraordinary this moment could be. And here's something that's a little ironic. So here we go. Or at least interesting. So just yesterday, September 9th, JY Park, Park Jin-young, the founder of JYP Entertainment, was appointed as co-chair of a brand new presidential committee on cultural exchange. So think about the contrast. Bang Si-hyuk facing a police summons on September 15th, while JY Park, just days earlier, is being elevated to a government post at the face of cultural diplomacy. Two of the biggest names in K-pop history moving in completely, kind of opposite directions. And these two guys are friends with each other and known to be great friends with each other and partners. And by the way, I actually covered the JY Park story in detail on my other channel, Classic Korea, where we break down the most talked about topics in Korea right now. So I'll drop the link. Check it out if you're interested, and don't forget to subscribe over there too. Now, here are some questions I would like to end with. Do you think Bang Si-hyuk's contracts were unfair manipulation or just a normal risk of private equity deals? And should regulators treat these kinds of agreements as illegal, even if all the investors made money? And when you look at the HYBE IPO, do you see Bang Si-hyuk as exploiting the system or as someone who took a massive gamble that happened to pay off? And how much of this controversy is about protecting investors and how much is politics? And if you were one of the early investors, would you feel misled or satisfied with the profits that you walked away with? So I know that you have already left many great comments, interest comments under these videos that I have already made. If you're interested, go back to the videos and relearn some of the details that we have already covered. And I'll be looking forward to your comments as always. But when you write comments, let's stay positive, respectful, and classy. Peace and love. Bye-bye.